The structure was silent except for the gentle whisper of the wind blowing through the trees. The moon made long, ghastly shadows over the tombstones, giving them nameless shapes in the dark. One grave amid them all stood apart. Story comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Not for its design or its inscription, but for the figure that would not leave its side. A German shepherd whose fur was matted with dirt, ribs faint under its thick coat. He was holding still, his body curled around the headstone, his nose against the cool marble, as though trying to cling to a smell that was already evaporating. His name was Shadow. He'd been there for 17 days. Rain had poured, the sun had burned, the wind had howled, and still Shadow never left. Residents came, they brought food and water, they murmured their condolences. But Shadow ignored them all. He simply waited. For what? No one knew. But what those who walked past the cemetery at night noticed was something more unnatural, a feeling, a presence. Others said they heard footsteps where no one was. Others swore the silhouette of a man stood next to the dog in the dead of night, then disappeared when they blinked. Most dismissed it as paranoia, a play of the low lights, but the owner of Shadow was known by the townspeople. A firefighter, a hero, a man who saved lives by the thousands, only to perish in a fire that should never have occurred. His name was Michael Carter, and Shadow had been his closest friend. A silent witness, one evening around sunset, a gray-haired man, Walter Green, approached the gates of the cemetery. Walter had known Michael well. He had seen the boy grow into a man. He had seen how the boy and Shadow were never apart. Now, looking at the mourning dog, something twisted in him. Shadow's amber eyes were dull, distant but not empty. Walter approached cautiously. "Shadow," he called gently. The dog didn't move. Walter sighed. "Son, he's gone. You can't wait here forever." Yet Shadow didn't so much as twitch an ear. Walter looked at the cemetery, feeling a shiver as the air turned colder. The air felt different. He exhaled, crouched near the dog, and reached hesitantly. "Come on, boy, let's go home." But before Walter could lay a finger on him, Shadow lifted his head. Walter froze. It wasn't the movement that surprised him. It was his own expression. Shadow wasn't just grieving. He was listening. To what? Walter couldn't say, but then Shadow stood up, after 17 days for the first time. Walter's breath caught. "Shadow?" The dog's ears perked up, his muscles coiled. Then he ran, straight into the dark. Walter's heart thudded in his ribcage. "Shadow, wait!" But the dog didn't stop. He vanished among the tombstones, body a blur of motion, tail thrashing like he was chasing something only he could see. Walter lurched forward, his cane only partly steadying him. His pulse pounded, because when he looked out at the vacant graveyard, the hairs on his neck stood up, and for the first time in 80 years of living, Walter Green had the sense he was not alone. Walter's heart thundered in his ears as he lurched forward, clutching his cane. His old bones complained, but he kept going. He couldn't. Shadow was running. The dog moved like a ghost, darting among the rows of headstones with a speed Walter had not seen in weeks. His muscles, stiff from days of being static, should have slowed him down. But they didn't. It was like something in him had caught fire. Walter pushed his legs to move faster as his breath came sharp and gaspy. "Shadow!" he called again. But the dog didn't stop. He ran soundlessly, body low, ears pinned back, fixated on what was not visible. Walter's stomach twisted. This was not a dog running after a rabbit. This was not a deranged animal exhausted by anguish. Shadow was trailing after something, and whatever it wasn't there. A presence in the dark. The wind screamed through the cemetery, shaking the empty limbs of the trees. The old iron fence cried out from the strain. Walter's gut told him to go back, but Shadow was not about to slow down. Then he stopped, so suddenly that Walter almost stumbled over his own feet. He gasped, steadying himself and scanning the graveyard. Thanks to Shadow's retyping, Shadow was in the center of a clearing, his body muscles stiff as stone. His tail was down, ears snagging the air. His eyes, those amber eyes, were fixated on something ahead. Walter's pulse pounded. He looked in the direction of Shadow's gaze, squinting in the dim light. He looked for gravestones and shadows. Then his stomach dropped, for there at the far end of the cemetery, a figure stood. Walter's breath caught. It wasn't moving, it wasn't breathing, just standing. The wind gusted, but the person did not tremble. Walter's hand tightened on his cane. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice thickening with hoarseness. Silence. Shadow growled low, guttural sound. Walter swallowed. The air had become viscous, coating his lungs. His body was screaming at him to leave, but his feet wouldn't budge. Then the figure stepped forward. Walter staggered back, but Shadow took a step toward it. Walter's voice barely passed through. "Boy, what are you doing?" Shadow ignored him. He wasn't afraid, even though he was moving slowly now, ears flat, tail tucked slightly. He was recognizing something. Walter's heart pounded. The shape was becoming clearer now, the darkness peeling away. It was tall, broad, in a costume that felt all too familiar. And then Walter's breath hitched, for at once he was no longer seeing a stranger. Michael Carter he was looking at, the man who had died, the man who had been interred right here, the man that Shadow had been waiting for. Walter's vision swam, his legs shook. This isn't real. This isn't possible. But Shadow didn't hesitate. The dog whimpered softly. And then he inched toward the figure. Walter's knees almost buckled. He wanted to cry out, to scream, to run, but before he could, the figure vanished. Like he wasn't there at all. Shadow froze, his body frozen in rock. Walter was panting, his chest clenched. His mind raced. Had he imagined it? Had grief deceived him? But then Shadow looked at him, and in the dog's eyes, Walter saw the answer. He hadn't imagined a thing. He inhaled sharply in quick, ragged breaths. His legs shook under him, his grasp on the cane wobbly. A few feet away, Shadow was tense, staring at the place where the figure had just disappeared. Walter's mind spun. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. Michael Carter was dead, buried right here under the same ground Shadow had been unwilling to leave. Yet Walter had seen him, or at least something that resembled him. A trick of the light? A hallucination? Walter's pulse raced and he swallowed hard. Shadow! The dog didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't blink. Instead, when he sat there, his ears twitching, waiting, that was it, as if expecting something. The wind howled around the graveyard, whistling through the cracks in the old tombs. Walter shivered. They had to leave, now. A warning from beyond. "Come on, boy," Walter said, willing his voice to remain steady. "Let's get out of here." Shadow turned his head a fraction, his amber eyes meeting Walter's, and then he whimpered. Walter's breath hitched. In all the years he'd known this dog, he'd never heard him make a noise like that. It was low, software, not fear, not sadness, something else. Walter slowly stepped forward. "Shadow?" The dog shook its head, thrusting its nose into the ground. Walter frowned. "What are you?" Then Shadow started digging. Walter's stomach twisted. The grave. Michael's grave. Walter's voice rose. "Shadow, stop it!" But the dog didn't listen. His paws moved more quickly, dirt flying out behind him as if he sensed something was buried there that shouldn't be. Walter leaned in and seized his collar. "I said stop!" Shadow barked sharply, but not at Walter, at something behind him. Walter froze. His heart stopped. He turned his head slowly, so painfully slowly, and what he saw sent his blood to ice, because the gravestone behind him, the gravestone he knew had been standing upright just a second ago, had fallen. The thick marble slab rested on its side, its inscription half buried in dirt. Walter's skin crawled. That wasn't possible. It was too heavy, too secure. The wind hadn't blown it over. Then what had? His throat tightened. His gaze glanced back down to the ground. Where Shadow had dug, something shone in the moonlight. Walter's breath hitched. Gradually, his shaky hands extended down. He brushed away the dirt, and there, half buried in the dirt, was a dog tag. Not just any dog tag, Michael's. Walter's chest tightened. This shouldn't be here. Michael had carried Shadow's tag with him, on a chain around his neck. Walter had looked up at it the day they buried his casket. So how was it here? Shadow whined again and pressed his nose to the metal. Walter's vision swam. His heart pounded. And the explanation could be just one. Someone or something had placed it here. And then, suddenly, Walter got it. Shadow had not simply been grieving. He hadn't just been grieving. He was trying to tell them something. Walter felt his hands tremble as he looked at the small metal tag. The wind screamed through the graveyard, but all he could hear was the thudding of his heart. This wasn't possible. That's what Michael had been buried with. So why was it here? Had someone dug it up? Had something else just abandoned it? Shadow whimpered softly, nudging Walter's arm. Walter swallowed hard. "What are you trying to tell me, boy?" Shadow lifted his head. His ears twitched. His nose flared. And then out of the blue, he left. Walter's breath caught. "Shadow, wait!" But the dog was on the run already, not away from the grave, toward something. Walter now looked over at where Shadow had gone, and his blood ran cold. A figure in the mist. At the far end of the graveyard, it was darker than the rest. It was the place where the old oak trees grew thick and twisted, their branches outstretched like skeletal hands towards the sky. Shadow ran right into it. Walter willed his feet to lift, his cane sinking into the moist earth with each forward thrust. His old bones complained, but he pressed on. His breathing came sharp and ragged. Shadow's feet hardly made a sound as he threaded between the tombstones, his body low, his gaze locked forward. Walter turned his head in the same direction, and then he saw it. Through the fog, he could make out a shadowy figure standing at the upmost edge of the trees. It was tall, motionless, watching. Walter's pulse spiked. Shadow slowed and growled low, rumbling from his belly. Walter tightened his grip on his cane. "Who's there?" No answer. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. Shadow's fur bristled. Walter's breathing quickened now. His instincts told him to turn around, but he didn't. Instead, he stepped forward. The moment he did, the figure turned and ran. Walter's heart pounded in his chest. Shadow barked and ran after it. Walter swore beneath his breath, "Shadow, stop!" But the dog was already gone. Walter pushed his cane into the ground, but it was barely steadying him as he stumbled forward. His legs felt leaden, his breath sharp, his chest constricted. He should not be following phantoms. But Shadow was running for something. He was looking for something, or someone. Walter pushed himself onward, following the sound of cracking twigs and rustling leaves as Shadow barreled into the woods. His lungs seared, his brain told him to quit, but he wouldn't stop until he arrived at the tree line. And then, silence. Shadow was gone. Walter's throat tightened, his heart was pounding as he scanned the darkness. "Shadow?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. Nothing. Just the wind whistling through the trees. Walter swallowed. He had to find him. After a moment's hesitation, he drew a deep breath and walked into the trees. The moment he did, the cemetery lights behind him sputtered. Walter froze. The wind died. The air turned thick, heavy. Then, from the darkness, a single sharp bark. Walter's breath hitched. And then, from further in the woods, a noise. Not Shadow. Something else. Something whispering. Walter's vision swam. He tightened his knuckles around the cane. His legs shook. And at that moment, for the first time in his life, Walter sensed that he had stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen. The silence was suffocating. Walter gasped unevenly, his breath coming in short wedges. Before him stretched a wall of trees, dense and dark, swaying branches curling upward like skeletal fingers, pressing against the night sky. It was heavy in the air, like an invisible blanket on his chest. Somewhere in that darkness, Shadow was roaming, alone, or maybe not alone. Walter swallowed hard. He had devoted his life to believing in what he could see, what he could touch. But this felt wrong. All the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. His instincts shouted at him to turn around. But Shadow was out there, and he wasn't going without him. Into the unknown. Walter held the cane and stepped forward. The ground was wet underfoot, and each step sank a bit in the mud. In the silence, his own footsteps echoed too loudly, too loud, too alone. "Shadow?" he called, his voice hoarse. Nothing. He gripped the wooden cane with his fingers. "Come on, boy. We need to go home." Still, nothing. He took another step and another, his heart pounding against his ribcage. The further he ventured in, the chillier the air grew. It encircled him like a fog, dense and oppressive. Then a rustle. Walter froze. He could hardly breathe, his ears opening. It had come from the left. A slow, deliberate sound, like footsteps, not Shadow, something else. Walter gripped the knob of his cane. He slowly turned his head, looking through the trees. At first, nothing. Then, a shadow moved. Walter's pulse spiked. Something, or someone was there, watching. His throat went dry. "Who's there?" No answer. Nothing but the wind, rustling through the leaves. Walter gasped, forcing himself to move. One step, then another, until a sound directly behind him, a branch snapping. Walter turned, his heart crashing against his ribs, but no one was there. The forest was still, silent, waiting. Walter swallowed hard. Then, from the distance, a bark. Shadow. Walter's breath caught. His body tense, he turned to the noise. It was faint. Further than it should have been. But it was him. "Shadow!" Walter called. Another bark, this time closer. Walter's chest tightened. He was moving. But why hadn't he come back? Worn and weary, Walter soared, his legs pounding against the ground with each stride. Branches slapped against his arms. His cane was no longer getting him steadied as he forged ahead. Then he saw it. A break in the trees. A small clearing. And in the middle, Shadow. Walter almost collapsed with relief. But then his breath hitched. Because Shadow wasn't alone. He stood beside something. Walter's vision swam as he pushed himself forward. His pulse thudded in his ribs. for lying on the jungle floor, caked in mud and leaves, was a jacket, a firefighter's jacket. Walter's stomach dropped. It wasn't just any jacket, it was Michael's, the one he wore the day he died. Walter gasped out his breath in short gulps. This wasn't possible. Shadow poked the jacket gently. He looked sad. Walter knelt, trembling hands outstretched. The fabric was real, cold, damp, not a memory, not a trick, real. Walter's pulse pounded. Then, Shadow snapped his head up. His ears flicked forward. His entire body tensed. Walter's breath hitched, because Shadow wasn't facing him. He was facing something behind him. Walter turned, and his blood ran cold. Walter's breath caught in his throat. Shadow froze, tense as a rubber band, amber eyes focused on something past Walter. Walter would have liked to turn around, but he could not. His body refused to move. The air had shifted, grown heavier, like the heaviness of something invisible sitting on his chest, holding him in place. Shadow gave a low, guttural growl. Then a whisper, not from the trees, not from the wind, from right behind him. Walter's stomach clenched, his pulse racing, his fingers curled into the moist earth. And then the whisper returned. Software broken, a name. Shadow. Walter's heart stopped. It wasn't his voice, and it wasn't the wind. Shadow whimpered. Walter closed his eyes tight and made himself breathe, but then slowly, so painfully slow. He turned his head. His breath hitched. For in the dark, all but lost in the dark, there was someone standing there, tall, broad-shouldered, familiar. Walter's vision blurred. His brain was screaming that it couldn't be. But his heart knew who it was, all right. Michael, or at least someone who looked like him. A message from the beyond. Walter's hands shook as he pushed himself up. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe. It just stood there. Shadow didn't growl anymore. He only watched. Walter's throat tightened. Michael! The moment he said the name, the figure stepped forward. Walter staggered backward, losing his grip on his cane. His legs felt weak. His chest tightened. He had buried this man, had watched the casket lowered to the ground. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Then, Michael spoke. Not in a full sentence, not in a voice that belonged to the living, but in a whisper, ragged and strained. Help! Him! Walter's breath caught. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, the figure vanished. Gone, like fog dispersing in darkness. Walter struggled to breathe, clutching his chest and trying to calm his galloping heart. Shadow whimpered quietly, then pushed Michael's jacket toward Walter with his nose. Walter hesitated. Then shakingly, he reached over and lifted it. It was drenched, the fabric heavy with soaked earth. It still reeked of ash. Walter's hands trembled. Shadow was looking up at him, waiting. Michael had said something. Help him. Walter swallowed hard. Who, boy? Shadow let out a small huff. Then he turned and began walking. Not back toward the cemetery, not back toward town, but deeper into the woods. Walter's pulse spiked. Shadow, where are you going? The dog didn't turn back. He only kept moving. Walter tightened his grip around the jacket. His legs were screaming at him to stop, to turn back, but something inside of him told him this wasn't over, and whatever had just taken place was only the beginning. Shadow knew what to do. He sidled through the taut underbrush so deftly, it seemed as if he walked this trail 100 times. His tail was down, his ears flopping at every sound. Walter trod behind him, shaking and holding Michael's wet, mud-caked jacket in his quaking hands. His mind was racing. Help him. That was what Michael, or whatever that thing was, had hissed before it disappeared into the night. Walter's breath was quick and ragged. Shadow wasn't just running around blindly. He was following something, and Walter had the sinking sense that they were walking toward a truth he wasn't ready to confront. A hidden clue. As they ventured through the forest, the trees grew closer together. Their gnarled branches blocked out the moonlight. Walter's pulse quickened. "Shadow, where are you taking me?" Shadow didn't slow, didn't hesitate. Then suddenly, he stopped. Walter almost collided with him, stopping himself just in time. The dog stood stiff, looking at something in front of him. Walter followed his eyes, straining to see through the dark. At first, he saw nothing. Just trees, just shadows. Then his breath caught. There, partly obscured by a tangle of fallen branches, was a rusted metal door. Walter's heart beat wildly against his ribs. It was wedged into the earth as though to point the way to something buried there. Shadow stepped forward, sniffing the air. Walter's mouth went dry. "What the hell is this?" He nervously dipped a finger in and swiped the surface clean. A metal handle, an old padlock. Walter hesitated. This wasn't some neglected vestige of the past. This was a sealed place. A place some don't want discovered. The lock breaks. Walter's hands snapped into fists. Michael's jacket was still wet against his flesh, the smell of smoke and earth embedded on it. His mind raced. Michael had died in a fire. But what if the truth was something else? What if Shadow had never been grieving his owner, but instead attempting to guide someone to this place? Walter lowered his gaze to the padlock. Old, rusted, but still intact. Who had locked this? And why? He raised his cane, and his breath was slow and steady. Then he swung. A sharp crack reverberated as metal struck the lock. Again, until snap. The lock broke. Walter took a deep breath and locked the handle. The air felt heavier. Shadow's tail twitched with nervous energy. Walter paused, and then, after a deep breath, he tugged. What was buried below? The door flared, creaking loudly, its rusted hinges protesting. Chilled air rushed up beneath him, replete with the smell of dampening soil, and something else. Something rotten. Walter's stomach twisted. Shadow whined softly. Walter made himself look inside. The stairwell descended into utter darkness. Walter's knuckles twisted more deeply around his cane. His gut said turn around, to close the door, to act as if he had never found it. But then he saw it. A flash of color just past the first step. Walter's breath caught. A piece of fabric, dirt-stained, torn, but still recognizable. His knees nearly buckled. It was the same fabric as Michael's uniform. Walter's fingers trembled. Michael's body had not been discovered anywhere around here, and yet a shred of his clothing was buried in the ground. Walter's breath hitched. Shadow gave a low whine, stepping closer. Walter exhaled shakily. He had to go down. The air was thick, heavy. Walter grabbed the lip of the entrance, his knees complaining as he slowly eased himself down to the first step. Shadow was at the top, his ears back, his amber eyes locked on Walter as if he'd wanted to stop him. Walter swallowed. "It's okay, boy," he said, muttering. "I have to see." Shadow whined softly. Then he followed. Walter gasped and pressed on down. The staircase was old, each wooden step creaking under his weight. As he proceeded deeper, it grew chillier. The air was full of the smell of wet soil, old metal, and something else. Something foul. Walter shoved himself forward. His fingers grazed the stone walls, crude and lopsided, the passageway closing in as they went down. Yes, his foot landed on solid ground. Walter inhaled, adjusting the grip on his cane. Shadow was standing next to him, his body tight and his ears fluttering. Walter fished around in his pocket, searching for his ancient lighter. His fingers trembled as he flicked it open. A thin flame came to life, and what it showed set Walter's blood running cold. A room of secrets. It wasn't just a cellar. It was a room, a secret chamber painstakingly constructed in the earth. It had rusty metal shelves lining the walls, dust-encrusted. There were papers scattered across the floor, notebooks, old equipment, items that had been left behind hastily. But that wasn't what caused Walter's hands to shake. It was the photographs, dozens of them, tacked to the back wall, moldering, and all of them were of Michael. Walter's breath hitched. Michael in uniform, Michael outside of the fire station, Michael with Shadow, and the most recent one, Michael the day before he died. Michael. Walter felt his knees almost buckling. Shadow whimpered, rubbing up against Walter's leg. Walter felt his heart racing in his chest. Who took these? Why were they hidden here? And then his gaze fell on the table. In the center sat a small metal lockbox, unused and dust-covered. Walter trembled as he lifted his fingers toward it. The lid creaked as it opened. Inside, among old documents and faded photographs, was a firefighter's badge. Walter's throat constricted with a catch of breath. He recognized it instantly. Michael's, the one that was buried with him. Walter's pulse spiked. Michael's badge was to be 6 feet below the ground in his casket. So why was it here? He picked it up with trembling hands. The instant his fingers felt the metal, a door above them slammed shut. Walter's head snapped up. Shadow let out a sharp bark. Walter's lighter flame bobbed wildly. Then, from the darkness behind him, a sound. Footsteps. Walter's entire body froze. They were not alone. The air in the hidden chamber was all the wrong sort. Thick, suffocating, alive. Walter's fingers were unsteady as he held the badge to Michael's chest, his knuckles clenched white. The badge was real, too real. It had been buried alongside Michael, so how was it here? His breath caught. His heart thudded against his ribs. The trapdoor above them had slammed shut, and now, footsteps echoing in the dark. Not his, not Shadow's. Someone else was here. Walter's hands went cold. His brain was screaming at him to get the hell out. But his body refused to move. Shadow stood beside him, taut with tension, fur bristling, amber eyes focused on the opposite end of the room. A deep growl came from his throat. Walter willed himself to turn his head. The lighter's weak flame flickered, hardly lighting the room. At first, he saw nothing, just the metal shelves, the scattered papers. Then, a shadow moved. Walter's breath caught. It was slow, deliberate. From the farthest corner of the room, the darkest corner, where the darkness was deepest, Walter's chest tightened. This wasn't possible. This wasn't real. But then, the shape moved closer, and Walter's world stopped. The face in the shadows. For a long moment, Walter was riveted and couldn't breathe. So because just out of the reach of the flickering light was Michael, Walter's heart banged against his ribs. His breath hitched. He gripped the badge tighter. Michael's uniform was dirty, frayed at the edges. His face was white, his eyes dark and sunken. He stood perfectly still, watching, waiting. Shadow whined quietly but did not stir. Walter clenched his fists. "Michael?" The name came barely out of his mouth. The figure didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't breathe. Walter's throat tightened, his chest ached. He had buried this man. He had watched the casket being lowered into the earth. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Yet here was Michael, standing directly in front of him. Walter swallowed hard, speaking in a near whisper. How? The figure did not move. Then finally, it moved. Not a step forward, not a shift in place, just a tilt of the head, slow, unnatural. Like it didn't know how to move anymore. Walter's pulse spiked. His knees wobbled and threatened to buckle. Shadow let out a low growl, and then Michael spoke, not in a full sentence, not in the voice Walter recalled, but in something twisted, strained, a whisper, broken and hoarse. Not safe. Walter's breath hitched, his throat tightened, and then Michael whipped his head toward the trapdoor above them. Shadow barked, loud, sharp, urgent. Walter's stomach dropped. Something was coming. Michael's mouth opened as if to speak, but before he could, there was the metallic creak of something above. Walter's chest clenched. A second later, the trapdoor began to open. Walter choked on his breath. The trapdoor above them, heavy and wooden, groaned upward as it lifted. His pulse pounded. Shadow's ears flattened, body taut, eyes fixed skyward. His growl deepened. Walter grasped Michael's badge with a vice grip. This was it. He forced himself to look. The lighter's flame fluttered wildly, throwing long shadows onto the dripping stone walls. And then a face appeared. Walter's entire body froze. It wasn't a monster. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man. Tall, lean, clothed in a dark jacket, his features not distinctly obvious in the low lighting. His eyes scanned the room. Then they landed on Walter, and in that moment it hit Walter. This man knew what was down here. A dangerous encounter. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Then the man spoke. His voice was low, sharp. You weren't meant to find this place. Walter's fingers tightened around the badge. His heart hammered within his ribs. Who are you? The man ignored the question. Instead, his gaze turned to Shadow. The growl of the dog shook the room, and his muscles were tense like a spring. The man breathed out through his nose. That dog is for Misha Hall. Walter's stomach twisted. What do you mean? The man cocked his head slightly. I mean, he should have died with his owner. Walter's breath hitched. A penetrating cold settled into his bones. Shadow let out a snarl. The man entered the room now, one heavy boot sticking slightly into the damp earth. Walter stepped back, using it for balance as he leaned on his cane. This man wasn't here to help. He was here to silence, and Walter was in his way, Michael's last clue. The man took a step closer. Walter's mind raced. He was old, slower. There was no way he could fight this man off. But Shadow was ready. Walter took a slow breath. Think. His eyes roamed the room. The photographs, the lockbox, Michael's badge. This place. This was where Michael had been before he died. And whatever had happened to him, this man knew. Walter tightened his grip on his cane. I don't know you, he said then, willing his voice to hold steady. But I know this. Michael didn't die in that fire by accident. The man smirked. The phrase sent Walter's stomach churning. Smart, old man, the man muttered. Walter's pulse spiked. What happened to him? The man exhaled. Does it matter? Walter's jaw clenched. Yes, it mattered. It mattered because Michael's ghost, his presence, was still here, trying to warn them. So, trying to tell Walter the truth. And now, Walter was close. Too close. The escape. The man sighed. You never should have come here. He rifled in his jacket for something. Shadow lunged. The dog was like lightning, his body striking the man, teeth shining. The man shouted a curse and backed away. Walter's heart thudded in his chest. This was their chance. He spun around, seized the lockbox from the table holding Michael's badge. "Shadow, let's go!" The man dropped the dog and ran toward Walter. Walter moved, faster than he had in years. His cane barely supported him as he rushed for the stairs. Behind them, the man growled, trying to get back up. "You don't know what you're doing, old man!" Walter ignored him. Shadow leaped with muscle bound up the steps. Walter climbed after him. He could hear the man scrambling, searching for his balance. But Walter didn't stop. He reached the top. He seized the edge of the trapdoor and slammed it shut. The lock clicked. Walter started to back away, gasping for air. Shadow stood next to him, his amber eyes alight with something fierce. Walter's pulse pounded. They had made it. But he knew this wasn't over. Whatever that man was, he would return. And now Walter had something that may be able to tell the truth. He glanced down at the lockbox he held in his hands. Michael had left behind a secret, and it was time to open it. Walter was seated at his old wooden kitchen table, staring at the lockbox. Shadow lay at his feet, breathing slow but alert, curling protectively around Walter's chair. The house was silent, but Walter's thoughts had far higher volume. He brushed his fingertips along the edges of the small rusted box, trembling slightly. Michael kept this to himself for a reason. The man had tried to reach out and stop him from taking it in the underground room. And now, Walter needed to choose. Did he open it? Or had he buried the past? His chest tightened. He had come this far. He couldn't stop now. Walter paused, his breath shaking, and grabbed a small screwdriver, forcing it beneath the rusted lock. He twisted, hard. The lock broke with a loud crack. Walter hesitated. Then he opened the lid, his hands shaking. Inside, among old, yellowed papers, was a tape recorder. Walter's breath hitched. There was a cassette tape inside already, its label faded, but one word remained: truth. His heart pounded. Shadow raised his head, looking at him intently. Walter swallowed hard. Then he pressed play. Michael Speaks' a pop of static noise flooded the room. Then a voice, familiar, rough, Michael's. Walter's blood ran cold. "If you're receiving this, I made it or not." Walter tightened his grip on the recorder. Michael's voice was shaky, tired, as if he had been recording this with the knowledge he was running out of time. "There's a reason you should know this. The fire. It wasn't an accident." Walter's stomach dropped. The fire that had killed Michael, at the time, believed to be nothing but an unfortunate mistake, had been planned. Michael's voice persisted, his breathing ragged. "I discovered something I was not meant to see, and now they want to silence me." Walter's chest tightened. Michael had known. He had known they were after him. Now, his voice was lower, almost a whisper. "If I'm ever killed, follow the dog. He'll lead you to the truth." Walter felt the air seize in his throat. Michael had known that Shadow wouldn't give up. He knew his dog would wait by his grave, looking for someone who would listen, and Walter had listened. Michael's last words echoed through the static. "Find them, Walter. Track them down before they track you down." Then, silence. Shaking, Walter set down the recorder. He inhaled in quick, jagged pants. The fire had been a cover-up. Michael had been murdered. And now, Walter had proof. Shadow let out a little whimper, nudging Walter's knee. Walter took a shaky breath, pushing his hands through his hair. What did he do now? The police were not going to believe an old man with a decades-old cassette tape. And whoever had been watching them wasn't going to stop now. Walter had to act fast. Before they found him first, Walter sat silent at the kitchen table, looking at the cassette recorder. Michael's voice was still ringing in his ears. "The fire was not an accident. They want to shut me up. Follow the dog." His hands shook as he rewound the tape and played it back. Every word, every warning. Michael had known they were coming for him, and now they were after Walter. Nowhere to hide. Walter gasped, then glanced down at Shadow. The dog watched him closely, his ears twitching at every little sound. Shadow knew that something was amiss, and he was ready. Walter clenched his jaw. He couldn't stay here. Whoever had murdered Michael had attempted to bury the truth. If they discovered Walter had the tape, they wouldn't allow him to walk away. He gripped the recorder tightly with his fingers. He had to get to the police. The shadows close in. Walter got to his feet, took his coat, and crammed the cassette into his pocket. Shadow jumped, alert as ever. Walter took a slow breath. "Let's go, boy." But the instant his hand reached for the doorknob, the porch light flickered. Walter froze, Shadow's ears pinned back. The air outside had changed. Silent. Still. Too still. Then, a soft creak, a footstep on the porch. Walter's heart thudded against his ribs. Someone was outside, waiting. Shadow let out a low growl. Walter backed away from the door slowly, his breath shallow. His mind raced. They had found him. He picked up the landline phone, which turned out to have its cord cut. His stomach dropped. Then a shadow flitted past the window. Walter's pulse spiked. His fingers wrapped his cane, breath short. They were already here. The escape Walter had seconds to decide. If he waited, they would be inside. He had to move. Now he turned to Shadow. "Back door, go." The dog didn't hesitate. He dashed toward the rear of the house, tail low, the gate a careful precision. Walter trailed after him, his legs wailing with every step. He got to the kitchen door, unlocked it, and crept out into the night. Cold air hit him like a slap. Shadow took off ahead of him, in the direction of the tree line behind the house. Walter followed, limping and dragging his cane into the wet earth. Behind them, a door slammed open. A harsh curse rang out into the night. They must have realized he was missing. Walter pushed forward, just a little farther. He just had to reach the street, find someone, get to the police. Then a gunshot. The noise shattered the stillness. Walter's breath hitched. Shadow barked, urging Walter toward the trees. They ran, the final warning. Walter's legs throbbed, his breath coming out in gulps. Shadow pressed forward, her ears laid back, guiding him through the dark. They could not go to the police station. Not yet. Not at the moment. They were already trying to stop them. Walter clenched his jaw. They needed a new plan. Then, Shadow came to an abrupt stop. Walter nearly ran into him. The dog remained stock still, its eyes trained forward. Walter followed his gaze, and his blood ran cold, as standing in the middle of the road was Michael, or at least his shadow. Walter's breath caught. Then Michael raised his hand, pointing not at Walter, not at Shadow, but to the only place they could go. Walter's stomach twisted. Michael wasn't warning them anymore. He was taking them somewhere, and Walter knew what lay waiting for him at the end of this path would change everything. Walter gasped sharply, his breath uneven. His legs hurt, his lungs hurt, but he didn't stop. Shadow pressed on, darting between trees, his tail down, his body tight. They had chased Michael's shadow to this place, and now, here, before them, was the abandoned fire station, the same fire station that Michael had once worked at, where he had died. Walter's chest tightened. Shadow gave a low whine, nuzzling Walter's leg. One blackened skeleton of a building, most of it haunted land. Walter clenched his jaw. This was where it had all begun, and now this would be the end of it. The final confrontation. Walter took a step forward, his cane embedding into the soft, damp earth. The door hung there, creaking in the wind. Shadow's ears flicked, then a sound, a footstep. Walter's pulse spiked. He wasn't alone. His fingers tightened around the recorder in his pocket. Michael's final words rang in his head. Discover them before they discover you. Walter inhaled and walked through the doorway. Smoky, burnt wood and rusted metal hung in the air. And then a voice, low, cold, familiar. You should have let it go, Gramps. Walter tightened his grip on the cane. Out of the shadows came the man from the underground chamber. The light in the room was dim from the moment they opened the door, so Walter only caught a glimpse of that face. It was enough, though. He saw the lift of Ewan's lips. Shadow issued a low, warning growl. The man sucked in his breath and shook his head. You don't get it, do you? Michael came too close to the truth. And now, so have you. Walter's jaw clenched. Michael wasn't killed in that fire, was he? Walter's voice was steady. The man's smirk faded. Walter's chest tightened. He already knew the answer. Michael had already been killed before the fire started. And the fire? It was supposed to bury it. The man stepped forward. It's over, Walter. You can't stop this. Walter reached slowly into his pocket and pressed play. Michael's voice echoed around the room. If you're listening to this, I didn't make it. The man's face shifted darkly. Walter didn't flinch. I have proof now, he said, and I'm not the only one. The man's eyes narrowed. Walter's heart pounded. Then a siren, loud, piercing. Red and blue lights flashed against the burned walls of the fire station. Walter exhaled sharply. He had called the police before getting over here, and now they had arrived. The man's jaw clenched. He stepped back, looking toward the door. Walter spoke again, his voice solid. It's over. The man's eyes blazed with anger, but he knew he had no escape. Then officers rushed in, guns raised, shouting. Within seconds, the man lay on the ground in handcuffs. Walter let out a nervous breath. It was over. The killer of Michael had been captured. But as Walter twisted, his chest constricted, because Shadow was looking at something different. Walter followed his gaze, and his breath caught. Michael's goodbye. There, standing in the doorway of the lapsed fire station, was Michael, or at least his silhouette, the same one Walter had seen in the graveyard, the same one he had observed in the underground room. Michael towered over him in full firefighter garb, looking exactly the same as he had before the fire. His expression was calm, peaceful. Walter's throat tightened. Shadow made a soft whimpering sound and took a step forward. Michael looked at the dog, and for the first time, Shadow wagged his tail. Michael smiled. Then slowly, he faded. Walter swallowed hard. Shadow whined softly, then lay at Walter's feet. And just like that, Michael was gone. Walter exhaled. His shoulders, for the first time in weeks, didn't feel so heavy. Michael's story was no longer buried. The truth had come out. And now, finally, Shadow could rest. Epilogue, a new beginning. Days later, Walter was at Michael's grave. Shadow lay on the ground at his feet, watching the world with soft, sleepy eyes. Walter placed Michael's badge softly on the headstone. You can rest now, son. I could hear wind whistling through trees. Walter gave Shadow a scratch behind the ears. The dog leaned into him. Michael was gone, but his legacy wasn't. Walter wasn't alone anymore. Shadow had found someone else to follow. And Walter, he had discovered something worth fighting for. As the sun sank lower in the sky, Walter inhaled one last time. Then, with Shadow at his side, he walked away.